History remembers the man who signed the deal. It almost never remembers the woman who decided which deal was worth making, who managed the household budget that freed up his capital for risk-taking, who maintained the correspondence that kept the family's network alive across continents and generations, who chose which charities to support and which institutions to align the family with, and who, in more cases than official history will admit, made the decision that the patriarch later took credit for. This is not a story about hidden feminist heroes waiting to be discovered, though some of what we're about to cover will feel exactly like that. It is something more structurally interesting and, in its way, more useful. A story about how old money dynasties have, for centuries, relied on a parallel system of power, operated almost entirely by women, that has been so effectively concealed by the conventions of its time that most people studying wealth and dynasty have simply never looked for it. The women of old money have not been powerless ornaments standing beside powerful men. In family after family, across centuries and continents, they have been the actual architects of dynastic continuity, managing the household economies that made capital accumulation possible, maintaining the social networks that turned money into power, educating the next generation in the values and behaviors that preserved family identity, and in a remarkable number of documented cases, making the direct financial and business decisions that built the fortunes we still study today. Today, we are going to excavate this history properly, not as a corrective gesture, but because understanding it changes everything we thought we knew about how the old money system we've been studying throughout this entire series actually works. This is one of the most overlooked stories in the history of wealth. Let's tell it properly. 1. The structural invisibility, why this history disappeared. Before we can examine the specific women and the specific mechanisms of their power, we need to understand why this history is so thoroughly obscured. Because the obscuring itself is a story about how power and gender intersected in the construction of dynastic wealth. The legal architecture of erasure. For most of the period during which the great Western old money dynasties were established, roughly the 17th through the early 20th centuries, the legal doctrine of coverture governed marriage in England, its colonies, and the early United States. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity was, in the precise language of the common law, covered by her husband's. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue or be sued independently. Any property she brought into the marriage, any income she generated, any inheritance she received, all of it became, legally, her husband's property to manage and control. This legal framework created an extraordinary historical distortion. Women who were, in practice, managing substantial wealth, household economies, estate management, business correspondence, investment decisions, were doing so within a legal structure that recorded all of it under their husbands' names. The historical record, wills, property deeds, business contracts, tax records, systematically attributes to men decisions and management that women were, in documented cases, actually making. The legal historian Amy Louise Erickson, in her landmark study, Women and Property, in Early Modern England, 1993, documented through painstaking archival research that women's actual economic activity, managing estates, lending money, running businesses while legally married, was far more extensive than the formal legal record suggests. The gap between legal attribution and actual economic agency is the first and most fundamental reason this history has been so difficult to recover. The social convention of self-effacement. Beyond the legal erasure, old money culture itself, particularly in its Western expression, developed specific social conventions that actively discouraged women from claiming credit for their economic and managerial contributions. We discussed in our Tacky video the old money taboo against discussing money directly and the broader cultural value placed on invisibility and understatement. This taboo applied with particular force to women who were expected to exercise influence and management without ever appearing to seek credit, authority, or public recognition for it. The historian Stephanie Kuntz, writing about American family history, has documented how the ideal of the Republican mother, and later the Victorian angel of the house, created a cultural framework in which women's actual economic and managerial labor was reframed in public discourse as purely domestic and moral guidance, even when the underlying activity was, in substance, financial management and strategic decision. Making of real consequence. A woman who effectively managed her family's entire financial affairs while her husband pursued his public business and political career would, within this convention, present her role publicly as supporting my husband, language that obscured the actual content of what she was doing. The archival consequence. The combined effect of legal erasure and social convention has produced a specific and measurable historical problem. The archives that historians use to study old money dynasties are systematically skewed toward documenting male activity, because male activity was the activity that was legally recorded, publicly discussed, and considered worth preserving in family histories, biographies, and institutional records. Recovering the actual history of women's economic agency within old money dynasties requires a different kind of archival work. Personal correspondence, household account books, diaries, and the careful reconstruction of decision-making processes from fragmentary evidence. This work has been done increasingly by historians over the past several decades, and what it reveals is genuinely remarkable. What we're about to cover in this video is not speculation or wishful historical revisionism. It is documented, archival, peer-reviewed history about specific women, specific decisions, and specific mechanisms of power that built and preserved some of the most significant fortunes in modern history. Stay with me. This is going to surprise you. 2. The household as financial institution, the economics of domestic management. To understand the first and most fundamental mechanism of old money women's economic power, we need to recognize something that modern observers consistently underestimate. The household of a great dynastic family was not a domestic space in the modern sense. It was a substantial financial and operational institution, and its management was almost without exception the woman's direct responsibility. The scale of household management. A great English country estate in the 18th or 19th century employed staff numbering from a dozen to several hundred: housekeepers, butlers, footmen, ladies' maids, cooks, gardeners, grooms, and dozens of specialized roles. The household budget for a major estate could exceed the entire annual income of a prosperous merchant family. Managing this operation required skills that any modern observer would immediately recognize as executive management: budgeting, staff supervision, supply chain coordination, quality control, and crisis management. This management function fell almost universally to the mistress of the house, the wife, and in many cases the dowager mother or other senior female family member. The historian Amanda Vickery, in her study The Gentleman's Daughter, 1998, documented in extensive detail how the household accounts of genteel English families were maintained, decision by decision, by women who were managing what amounted to a mid-sized business operation. Purchasing decisions, staff payroll, supplier relationships, and budget allocation across dozens of categories of expenditure. The financial discipline this required was substantial. A poorly managed household could consume capital that should have been available for investment, land improvement, or business expansion. A well-managed household freed up capital precisely because operating costs were controlled efficiently, meaning that the male head of the family's capacity to take business and investment risks depended directly on his wife's household management competence. Household management as capital allocation. This point deserves emphasis because it is so consistently overlooked. Household management was not merely a cost center to be minimized. In the hands of a skilled manager, it was an active site of capital allocation decisions with direct consequences for family wealth. Decisions about whether to renovate or rebuild, whether to expand or contract staff, which suppliers and tradespeople to support, often itself a strategic decision with implications for the family's standing in local economic networks. How to manage the agricultural operations of the estate's home farm, and how to allocate the household's substantial annual budget across competing priorities. These were genuine financial management decisions, made continuously by women whose names rarely appear in the family's official business or financial records. The historian Leonore Davidoff and Catherine Hall, in their influential work, Family Fortunes, Men and Women of the English Middle Class, 1780 to 1850, 1987, documented how the supposedly separate public sphere of male business activity and private sphere of female domestic management were, in actual practice, deeply intertwined, with women's domestic financial management directly enabling and constraining the business activities that were publicly attributed to men. The American Plantation Mistress, a specific and troubling case study. In examining old money, women's economic management, intellectual honesty requires that we address one of history's most significant and troubling examples directly: the role of plantation mistresses in the American South, whose household and agricultural management responsibilities were inseparable from the system of chattel slavery that generated their family's wealth. The historian Stephanie Jones Rogers, in her landmark 2019 study, They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, documented through extensive archival research that white women in slaveholding households were not passive beneficiaries of a system managed entirely by men. They were, in many documented cases, direct owners, managers, traders, and disciplinarians within the institution of slavery, managing enslaved labor forces, making decisions about the sale and purchase of enslaved people, and directly profiting from and perpetuating the system. This history matters for our broader subject because it demonstrates, in its most morally serious form, the same underlying reality we are documenting throughout this video. Old money, women's economic management responsibilities were extensive, direct, and consequential, for better, and in this case, for profoundly worse. Their economic agency was not always benevolent, and recovering the full history of women's power within old money systems requires acknowledging the full range of what that power was used for. 3. The marriage strategists, women as architects of dynastic alliances. We discussed, in our second video in this series, how old money families have historically used marriage as a mechanism for building alliances, consolidating resources, and maintaining class boundaries across generations. What we did not discuss in sufficient depth is who actually executed this strategy, and the answer is overwhelmingly women. The mothers who built empires through marriage. The matchmaking function within old money families, identifying suitable partners, arranging introductions, evaluating candidates' family backgrounds and financial positions, and orchestrating the social occasions through which courtships developed, was, across virtually every documented old money tradition, a function performed primarily by mothers, aunts, and senior female relatives. This was not incidental social activity. It was strategic decision-making with enormous financial and dynastic consequences, executed by women who developed genuine expertise in evaluating family lineages, financial circumstances, and social positioning. The most studied case in American history is the so-called dollar princess phenomenon of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The systematic matchmaking between wealthy American heiresses, whose families had new industrial fortunes but lacked aristocratic status, and impoverished European nobility, who possessed titles and ancient lineage but desperately needed capital. Alva Vanderbilt, wife of William Kissam Vanderbilt, and one of the most strategically ambitious women in American Gilded Age society, orchestrated her daughter Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage to Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, in 1895. The marriage was, by every documented account, arranged primarily by Alva herself, against her daughter's wishes, as a calculated transaction. Vanderbilt, industrial capital in exchange for the prestige and social legitimacy of one of England's oldest aristocratic titles. The dowry Alva negotiated, reportedly worth $2.5 million in 1895 dollars, equivalent to tens of millions today, directly funded the restoration of Blenheim Palace, the Marlborough family seat, which had fallen into serious disrepair due to the family's depleted finances. This was not an isolated incident. The historian Gail McColl and Carol McD. Wallace, in their book To Marry an English Lord, 1989, documented that between 1870 and 1914, more than 100 American heiresses married into the British aristocracy in arrangements that were, in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, negotiated and orchestrated by the mothers of the American families involved. The sophistication of the strategy. What is particularly striking about this history is the sophistication of the financial and strategic thinking involved. These were not simply socially ambitious mothers seeking titles for their daughters. They were executing a calculated capital allocation strategy. American industrial wealth was abundant, but lacked the multi-generational social legitimacy and institutional connections that European aristocratic titles conferred. European aristocratic families possessed exactly that legitimacy and connection, but were, in many documented cases, in genuine financial distress due to declining agricultural land values and the costs of maintaining ancestral estates. The marriage transaction solved both problems simultaneously. American capital flowed to British and European estates, providing the liquidity needed for restoration and ongoing operation, while American families gained the social capital, titles, aristocratic connections, entry into European high society, that no amount of money alone could purchase in a single generation. This is, in essence, a sophisticated cross-border capital and social capital arbitrage strategy. And it was conceived, negotiated, and executed almost entirely by women, operating through correspondence networks, social introductions, and direct negotiation with the families involved, work that occurred almost entirely outside the historical record we typically associate with business or finance. The continuing tradition in modern form. This strategic matchmaking function has not disappeared in the modern era. It has simply become less formalized and less explicitly discussed, consistent with the broader old money preference for discretion that we documented in our privacy video. Sociological research on contemporary elite marriage patterns, including the work of sociologist Seamus Khan, whom we cited in our tacky video, has documented that the social architecture of elite boarding schools, debutante events, and exclusive social clubs continues to function as a matchmaking infrastructure, even though the explicit transactional negotiation of earlier eras has given way to a more organic seeming process of natural social mixing among similarly positioned families. The mothers and grandmothers who organize, attend, and orchestrate participation in this social infrastructure, who decide which debutante balls their daughters attend, which summer communities the family spends time in, which social events warrant the investment of time and attention, continue to perform a strategic function that is substantively similar to Alva Vanderbilt's, even if the explicit transactional language has been replaced by softer, more contemporary framing. 4. The philanthropic architects, women who built the institutions. We have discussed throughout this series how charitable foundations function simultaneously as genuine philanthropy, tax strategy, and mechanisms of institutional power and social influence. What deserves dedicated attention is the extent to which the actual operational philanthropy of old money families, as distinct from the formal foundation structures that often bore men's names, was conceived, designed, and managed by women. The Gilded Age philanthropic architects. The period of greatest American old money fortune accumulation, the late 19th and early 20th centuries, coincided with an explosion of women's philanthropic activity that built much of the cultural and social infrastructure we still associate with the era's wealthy families. Louisine Havmeyer, wife of sugar industrialist Henry Osborne Havmeyer, was by any objective measure one of the most important art collectors and museum benefactors in American history. Working closely with the painter Mary Cassatt, Havmeyer assembled a collection of Impressionist and Old Master paintings that she ultimately bequeathed to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a collection that fundamentally shaped the Met's holdings of European art. Havmeyer was also a committed suffragist, using her social position and wealth to fund and organize the women's suffrage movement in New York, including financing a major suffrage parade in 1915. The historian and art historian Frances Weitzenhofer, in her study The Havmeyers, Impressionism Comes to America, 1986, documented that Havmeyer's collecting decisions, informed by genuine connoisseurship, developed through decades of close study and her relationship with Cassatt, were substantially more sophisticated and forward-thinking than the art collecting decisions of many of her male contemporaries, who often relied entirely on dealers' recommendations. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, wife of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., was the principal force behind the founding of the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1929. Working with two other women, Lily P. Bliss and Mary Quinn Sullivan, Rockefeller identified the gap in New York's cultural institutions. No major museum was collecting contemporary art. Secured the founding collection, recruited the museum's first director, and provided the funding and institutional backing that established MoMA as one of the world's most significant cultural institutions. Her husband, John D. Rockefeller, Jr., was reportedly skeptical of modern art and provided financial support somewhat reluctantly, in deference to his wife's clear vision and determination. The settlement house movement, direct social engineering. Beyond elite cultural institutions, old money women were the primary architects of the settlement house movement. A network of community institutions in immigrant and working-class neighborhoods that provided education, healthcare, childcare, and social services, and that fundamentally shaped the development of American social work and social policy. Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago, perhaps the most famous settlement house, required substantial ongoing funding, much of which came from wealthy women who provided not just financial support, but direct organizational involvement. Louise DeKoven Bowen, a wealthy Chicago heiress, served as president of the Hull House Board for decades, providing both the funding and the strategic leadership that sustained the institution's operations across a period of enormous social change. The historian Catherine Kish Sklar's research on women's reform networks in this period has documented how wealthy women used their philanthropic activity not merely as charitable giving, but as a deliberate strategy for influencing public policy. The settlement house movement's research and advocacy directly shaped early 20th century labor law, child welfare policy, and public health regulation, at a time when women could not yet vote and had no formal access to legislative power. This is institutional power exercised through philanthropic infrastructure precisely because direct political power was legally unavailable. The women who built these institutions were not engaged in charity as a secondary or decorative activity. They were engaged in policy influence and institutional construction through the only channels available to them. And the channels they built have outlasted, in many cases, the political structures that excluded them. 5. The widows who ran empires. Direct business control. We come now to the most direct and least disputable form of old money women's economic power. Instances where women took direct, formal, documented control of family businesses and fortunes, often as widows, but in a significant number of cases, during their husbands' lifetimes as well. Hetty Green, the wealthiest woman in America. Hetty Green, born in 1834 to a wealthy New Bedford whaling and trading family, inherited a substantial fortune and, through 6 decades of active personal investment management, built it into one of the largest individual fortunes in American history. At her death in 1916, her estate was valued at approximately $100 to $200 million, equivalent to several billion dollars today, making her, by a wide margin, the wealthiest woman in America and one of the wealthiest individuals of either gender in the country. Green's investment approach was, by the standards of any era, exceptionally disciplined. She favored government bonds and high-grade mortgages, maintained extensive cash reserves, and was famous for buying aggressively during financial panics. Most notably, the Panic of 1907, when she provided emergency liquidity to New York City and several financial institutions at favorable terms, profiting substantially from her willingness to act when others panicked. The financial press of her era nicknamed her the Witch of Wall Street, a moniker that reflected the deep discomfort her contemporaries felt about a woman who managed her own fortune with greater discipline and success than most of her male peers. Modern financial historians, including Charles Slack, in his biography Hetty, The Genius and Madness of America's First Female Tycoon, 2004, have reassessed Green's reputation, documenting that her investment philosophy, patient, contrarian, focused on capital preservation, closely anticipated principles that Benjamin Graham would later formalize as value investing, and that we discussed in our previous video as foundational to the old money investment approach. Madam C.J. Walker, building a dynasty from nothing. Sarah Breedlove, who built her fortune under the name Madam C.J. Walker, represents a different but equally significant case. A self-made woman who built one of the first substantial Black-owned business fortunes in American history entirely without inherited capital or family wealth through the development and marketing of hair care products for Black women. Walker's business, built from the 1900s through her death in 1919, generated sufficient wealth that she was, by some estimations, the first self-made female millionaire in American history of any race. Her daughter, Alelia Walker, inherited and continued the business, while also becoming a central figure in the cultural life of the Harlem Renaissance, using the family's wealth to fund and host gatherings that supported Black artists, writers, and intellectuals. The Walker case is significant for our broader subject because it demonstrates that the structural mechanisms we've documented throughout this video, household financial management, strategic philanthropy, institutional building, were not exclusive to white old money families. Walker built her own dynasty using comparable strategic principles: aggressive reinvestment of profits, strategic use of philanthropy to build social capital and institutional legitimacy, and careful preparation of her daughter to continue and extend the family's social and economic influence. The widows who simply took over. Beyond these prominent individual cases, the historical record contains a consistent and underappreciated pattern. Women who, upon their husbands' deaths, took direct control of substantial business operations, not as figureheads, but as actual managers and decision-makers, and ran them successfully, often for decades. The historian Susan Ingalls Lewis, in her study of women business owners in 19th century Albany, New York, documented dozens of cases of widows who took over their husbands' businesses and operated them successfully. Manufacturing concerns, mercantile operations, and financial enterprises, often for periods far exceeding the husband's own tenure, while the historical record continued to refer to the business by the deceased husband's name. This pattern reflects a specific reality. The formal legal and social structures of the era assumed male business leadership, but the practical reality of family business continuity frequently depended on women who had, in many cases, already been deeply involved in the business's operations during their husbands' lives, managing correspondence, understanding the customer relationships, knowing the financial details, and who were therefore far better prepared to assume control than the formal historical record, which often barely mentions their involvement, would suggest. 6. The modern expression, how this history continues today. The structures that obscured women's economic agency in earlier centuries, coverture laws, the Convention of Public Self-Effacement, the archival bias toward male attribution, have largely been dismantled in the modern era. And the result, when we look at contemporary old money family governance, is a clearer and more direct picture of the same functions we have documented historically, now operating with greater visibility. Women in modern family office leadership. The 2023 Campton Wealth Global Family Office Report, which we have cited throughout this series, found that women now hold senior leadership positions, including Chief Investment Officer and Chief Executive Officer roles, in a meaningfully growing proportion of family offices globally, though the report also documented that significant gender disparities persist in compensation and formal authority, even when women perform substantively similar functions to their male counterparts. This finding is illuminating precisely because it mirrors the historical pattern we have documented. Women's substantive economic contribution to family wealth management frequently exceeds their formal recognition and compensation. A continuity between the documented historical pattern and contemporary practice that suggests the structural dynamics we have described are not simply artifacts of a less enlightened past, but ongoing features of how dynastic wealth management operates. Abigail Johnson and the Fidelity Model. Abigail Johnson's leadership of Fidelity Investments, which we discussed in our previous video on the global old money investment portfolio, represents one of the clearest contemporary examples of formal, public, undisputed female control of a major old money family enterprise. As chairman and CEO of Fidelity since 2014, having worked her way through multiple roles within the company over more than 3 decades, Johnson manages a firm overseeing more than $4.5 trillion in assets, making her one of the most powerful individuals of any gender in global finance. What is notable about the Johnson case, in the context of this video's broader subject, is the contrast it presents with the historical pattern we have documented. Johnson's leadership is fully attributed, publicly recognized, and formally documented, a genuine structural change from the historical pattern of women's economic management being systematically obscured or attributed to male relatives. Mackenzie Scott and the new model of philanthropic architecture. We discussed Mackenzie Scott's distinctive philanthropic approach in our video on ultra-wealthy power restructuring. Her preference for large, unrestricted grants to community organizations, in contrast to the more strategically directed model exemplified by foundations like the Gates Foundation. Viewed through the lens of this video's subject, Scott's approach can be understood as a direct continuation of the philanthropic architecture tradition we have documented historically, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller's founding of MoMA, Louise de Koven Bowen's leadership of Hull House, updated for a contemporary context in which Scott's role is fully public, fully attributed, and exercised with complete formal authority over billions of dollars in charitable capital, rather than operating through the informal, often unattributed channels available to her historical predecessors. The continuing pattern of household and family governance. Despite these examples of full public attribution, sociological research on contemporary wealthy family governance continues to document a persistent pattern. Much of the day-to-day work of maintaining family cohesion, preparing the next generation for wealth stewardship, and managing the social and relational infrastructure that underlies the family's institutional power continues to be performed primarily by women, work that remains less formally recognized and less visible than the public-facing business and investment leadership roles, even within families that have made significant progress toward formal gender equality in business leadership. The family wealth researcher James Hughes, whose work on family governance we cited in our second video, has noted in his more recent writing that the most successful multi-generational families he has studied are increasingly those that have formally recognized and structured the human capital and social capital development functions, historically performed by women, often without formal title or compensation, as genuine governance roles with corresponding authority, recognition, and resources. What we have documented in this video is not a story about women being secretly more important than history gave them credit for, told for its own sake. It is a correction to our entire understanding of how old money dynasties have actually functioned, a correction that matters because the mechanisms we've identified throughout this series, household financial management, strategic marriage alliances, institution-building philanthropy, and direct business control during succession crises are not peripheral to dynastic wealth preservation. They are central to it. Every dynasty we have studied throughout this series, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Rothschilds, the Waltons, the great Asian business families, built and preserved their wealth through structures that depended, at every level, on the economic competence, strategic judgment, and institutional vision of women whose contributions the formal historical record has persistently minimized. Recovering this history does more than correct an injustice, though it does that too. It gives us a more accurate and more complete model of how multi-generational wealth actually works. A model in which household management is recognized as genuine capital allocation, in which philanthropic and social architecture is recognized as genuine institutional power, and in which the full range of human talent within a family, not merely the talent that happened to be formally recognized by the legal and social structures of a given era, is understood as the actual engine of dynastic continuity. The women of old money were never powerless. They were, for centuries, operating the most important machinery of dynasty, quietly, persistently, and almost entirely without credit. Understanding that machinery, finally, in full, is long overdue. Comment below. Which woman in this video surprised you the most? Hetty Green, Abby Rockefeller, Alva Vanderbilt, Madam C.J. Walker? Or was there someone else's story you already knew that belongs in this conversation? Tell me. This is exactly the kind of history that deserves more attention, and your comments help me know what to cover next. Hit like if this video gave you a genuinely different and more complete picture of how dynastic wealth actually works. This is one of the more important videos in this series, and it deserves to reach more people. Subscribe and hit the bell. Share this video with someone who has only ever heard the great man version of how fortunes are built. The real history is more complete, more interesting, and frankly, more useful than the version most of us were taught. I will see you in the next one.